In this week's Planet Korea, we're going to pick up our occasional series on Korean urbanism with Colin Marshall. Colin is the local blogger for the Los Angeles Review of Books and just a prolific podcaster, writer, and expert on the topic of urban life in cities around the world. We've been talking about this particular discussion for a long time now, and I'm glad we're finally getting around to it. Colin, as a longtime resident of Los Angeles, and we're both residents of Seoul for a fair number of years, and so we've been wanting to talk about this Los Angeles-Seoul comparison. Los Angeles in particular is undergoing some deep changes that may offer some insights regarding Seoul's future development, and I've got Colin in the studio to bounce some ideas back and forth. Hey, Colin.
Good to be here. We've both been in America a bit, I know, so it's we're back in town now.
A little bit of back and forth, yes.
Urbanism segment.
No place is home in the 21st century, but we can kind of call some places home. And to liven up this discussion, we had a little bit of a brainstorm a little while ago, and we've pulled some clips from various music, documentaries, and so forth, and we'll inject them into the discussion. So, Los Angeles. I mean, I know you're not a native in terms of lifelong living in Los Angeles, but you connect very strongly to Los Angeles.
I am indeed obsessed with Los Angeles, as some Angelinos, a small minority, are. I moved from there to Seoul, in fact, with the sense that I would keep writing about Los Angeles, keep using Los Angeles as an object of study in a way and of comparison, because I wanted to understand Los Angeles better. In a way, it helps to go outside of Los Angeles. And, this is a city that everybody kind of knows on some level. Do you know Los Angeles? What do you know about it?
I'll tell you this. Impressions are all I have of Los Angeles. I've been there for a day or two at a time, not nearly enough to know the city. And, the impressions I have are mainly those that I got in my youth. I'm kind of the first generation MTV kind of people, and I actually pulled two songs that basically set the impression in my mind of Los Angeles. This one was on rotation constantly, 24 hours a day, way back when. This is Randy Newman, I Love L.A. Let's give that a quick listen. So there are first impressions, Colin. Sunshine, top down. He named a whole bunch of freeways and Santa Ana this. And do you get misty-eyed hearing about that?
Well, Randy Newman's I Love L.A., it's such a both ironic and sincere, deeply ironic and deeply sincere tribute to the city. You see that in the video as well as you hear it in the song. And that reflects, I think, a lot of people's experience with Los Angeles. They sincerely love it, and they deeply ironically regard it as well. They can't quite love it fully, but they can balance it with a kind of irony, with, lines about the bums and the scuzziness. And, Randy Newman he's a lover of Los Angeles, but in the way that many people are, he's also looking askance at it.
There's sort of the Tinseltown aspect. As an outsider, I look at LA surely, as many, many Americans do, surely as many East Coast people do, through the lens of Hollywood, through the lens of superficiality and beauty and suntans and all that stuff.
Of course.
And you know what song really created an impression for me was that song by Missing Persons, Walking in LA, kind of delineating the hierarchy of who lives in LA. Let's give that a quick listen. Colin, only a nobody walks in LA. I can't even tell you how deep an impression. I was even just in some point in my 20s, I was walking in LA on the sidewalk, and that song was ringing through my head. I had this sense in the back of my mind, I must be a loser because I'm not in a car, in a convertible, that kind of thing,
Well, I'll tell you, when I lived there in the 2010s, I never had a car, in the early 2010s, and I think that the city has changed since the early 80s when that song came out, but you mentioned the view of Los Angeles, through Hollywood. And there's a documentary I would recommend called Los Angeles Plays Itself by a guy named Tom Anderson, Cal Arts professor. It's a documentary about how Los Angeles has been seen through film in the past 70, 80 years. And he says, they say no one walks in Los Angeles. They mean no rich white person walks. Even in the 80s, that was a specific group that considered there to be no walking done in Los Angeles. But now you see a lot more, how to put it. The city's become, to use the urbanist slang, multimodal. A lot of people are driving, but more are walking, more are busing, more are subwaying, biking. There's a bike share system now, more than one, in fact, just like Seoul has.
Yeah, okay, so you're not automatically a loser if you're not in a convertible car going down the freeways. We have to kind of, recognize that LA is a product of how it was built, how it was laid out, freeways everywhere, spread out. And in fact, you recommended a clip from a documentary where I believe his name is Christopher Hawthorne. Is that correct?
Yes,
he's a journalist.
Christopher Hawthorne is the sort of new observer of Los Angeles. He was recently the architectural critic for the Los Angeles Times. He has a sense of what they call the third Los Angeles. He sees Los Angeles as being developed in three phases. There was the first one from the late 19th century to World War II. The second Los Angeles, the one everybody knows, the Southern California lifestyle of the World War II.
Randy Newman, I Love LA lifestyle.
Yes, the second, and Randy Newman's driving a car in that video. The freeways, yards, single-family houses, beaches, mountains, all that kind of thing. That's the second Los Angeles. The Second World War to the end of the 21st century, we're now in what he calls the third Los Angeles.
All right, we hear him talk about it in this clip. Let's give that a listen.
It no longer dreams of infinite expansion the way it long did, of growing its way out of every problem. It's increasingly offering residents a variety of ways to move around the city, from car share and bike share to new transit lines. But it's too easy to say simply that Los Angeles is moving into a new phase of civic identity from A to B. That idea overlooks one important fact. Many of the elements we're now working to add or improve, mass transit, pedestrian culture, experimental multifamily architecture, ambitious civic buildings, Los Angeles actually produced in remarkable quantities at the end of the 19th and the start of the 20th centuries. In our civic DNA is something before the car, before the freeway, before the concrete LA River and the lawn and the smog.
Colin, I love that phrase. In our civic DNA.
Our civic DNA, yes.
What is it?
Christopher Hawthorne, as I say, he was the critic of the Los Angeles Times, architectural critic. I was in Los Angeles recently, as we say. I was hanging out with him talking about these matters. And yes, this is a clip from a public television documentary called Christopher Hawthorne's Third Los Angeles. And civic DNA is this concept he brings up to say, Los Angeles, people will say all around the world, Los Angeles was built for the car. That's a common phrase you hear. But in fact, it was not built for the car. It was built in an era of in fact, trains. At one point, it had the largest train system, I think I'm correct in saying, the largest urban rail system in the world, the most expansive urban rail system in the world. The DNA is there. It was built as, in a sense, a more classical city, a denser city, that it was sort of erased in the era of the second Los Angeles after the Second World War, but now is being rediscovered in Los Angeles. In fact, one of the changes that I was anticipating when I went back in the 2 years since I moved here, this was the first trip back. One was to ride a train from downtown Los Angeles to Santa Monica, where the beach is. That, for the first time, is possible again, and it hasn't been possible since the early 1960s, I believe, maybe the 1950s. So there is a rediscovery of that civic DNA Christopher talks about.
When you talk about that expansive rail network of the first Los Angeles, I get a feel for Seoul. I mean, Seoul is the most... when you look at the rail networks of Seoul and its surrounding regions, it looks like a bowl of noodles. It's so well covered by rail, not to mention bus and public transport. That said, Seoul residents kind of have an LA-ish addiction to their cars. So Seoul is almost in between the two iterations of Los Angeles.
That's very true. There's more cars on the street than in Los Angeles in Seoul.
Are there really?
I mean, compare. Yeah. Go to Los Angeles, go to Seoul, look at the streets. Always, 24 hours a day, streets full of cars in Seoul. In Los Angeles, at least the nights are relatively empty of cars. But here, you're always going to see some flow of traffic, right?
Yes. Well, to hear you describe this and to hear Christopher Hawthorne describe this, I didn't realize that LA was in this state of flux, in this state of rediscovery. I still have this stereotype and this baggage in my mind of LA as the ultimate car city. And if you don't have a car, you're just like missing persons. You're a nobody.
You and millions of other people have
Right.
that idea. But Los Angeles has been expanding. The second Los Angeles was all about expanding outward through most of the 20th century. Now it's got to as far as it can. The limits have been reached. Now it's time to turn back in and densify to, I was at this building, the Wilshire Grand Center in Los Angeles. It was newly opened since I left, and it's actually a certain Korean airline provided the money for this building. So
Okay.
when you go there to downtown Los Angeles, you see the very Korean flag-looking emblem of this airline shining off the top of this new tower. But you see that, you realize things are changing in the built environment. It's going up. It's not just going out. It's going up now as well.
Could you have taken your last 2 minutes of commentary there and replaced the word Seoul in with Los Angeles? Could you say Seoul has expanded outward and sprawled as far as it can or needs to, and it needs to somehow change from a horizontal to a vertical perspective?
Both Los Angeles and Seoul have elements they need to focus on now. Los Angeles needs to densify. Seoul is pretty dense already, isn't it?
Sure.
Seoul, though, when a foreigner friend visits, especially a Westerner friend visits, what do they always complain about?
Traffic, space.
And how it looks, right?
And how it looks, it's a little boxy. That has improved. I mean, when I first arrived in Seoul, it was a posting, and I had just come from Hong Kong, which is visually one of the most stunning cities in Asia. So I was a little bit down on Seoul when I arrived, say, 15 years or 12 years ago. Seoul has improved. It has put out there a lot of random, senseless acts of beautification.
Yes.
Cheonggyecheon and this and that building.
Some of which we've covered on this segment.
Of course. So, Seoul's doing okay. I give Seoul a lot of points for effort, and I can see Seoul on a trajectory. Los Angeles has got no apologies to make to anybody in terms of aesthetics. It's a stunning city.
It has that heritage, and people often talk about the heritage of architecture it has. But when I was talking to Christopher Hawthorne recently, when you talk to anybody who is interested in architecture in Los Angeles, they say, what about this era of the first and second Los Angeles, when it really was considered a home for ambitious architecture where you could do whatever you want, build whatever you want, go crazy. That era seems to have been forgotten. Los Angeles has forgotten how to build a truly interesting building. The Wilshire Grand Center, which I mentioned, has that certain Korean Airlines logo beaming off the top. It's impressive in its height, but not so impressive aesthetically.
Okay.
Los Angeles could find its own style again in the way that Seoul could find its style. It's grown, but it hasn't really had a style per se. I think you might agree.
Yeah. I mean, we've got a clip from Reyner Banham. He's a real old school architecture expert.
Yes.
And you'll hear from the music. And this is an old documentary. So the audio
1972.
quality. 1972. The audio quality is not, what I would call pristine, but you'll hear the early 70s music behind it. And I just want to capture what he says. It's a very short clip. Have a listen.
I'm Professor of the History of Architecture at University College London, and you might wonder what I'm doing in Los Angeles, which makes nonsense of history and breaks all the rules. Well, I love the place with a passion that goes beyond sense or reason.
Los Angeles breaks all the rules and goes beyond reason. It makes nonsense of history, and I love it with a passion beyond reason. Do you think many people have said that about Seoul?
Certain Englishmen, for sure, and obviously Reyner Banham was an Englishman, and he never lived in Los Angeles, but he visited often, wrote this book that I'm tapping now. I'm holding it up, Los Angeles, The Architecture of Four Ecologies. One of the essential books to understand Los Angeles. Came out the year before that documentary, 1971, and he looked at Los Angeles, which was even then regarded as sort of a mess with no real design to it, no real qualities to it, just a sort of a bunch of things put together. He saw what was new about it, what was different about it, and in a way to the detriment of the discourse about Los Angeles, because in a way, the way people talk about Los Angeles is a form of complacency. You say Los Angeles doesn't have a center. You can say, like Banham did, it's polycentric. There are multiple centers everywhere. You say Los Angeles, there's too many roads, too many freeways. Oh, it's a motion-oriented city. So he saw something interesting in that. But of course, there are many deficiencies in that are implicit and that are now being, I would say, corrected. Whether you think Los Angeles has its own style of urbanism, or whether you think it's, a lot of mistakes were made, that's a philosophical divide. Banham was on one end of that. But I think even though I disagree with him on a lot of things, his analysis, his way of seeing Los Angeles is still extremely, extremely valuable. And Seoul, people often come here and complain about, as we say, how it looks, the aesthetics. But if you look at Seoul right, you can see why this developed this way, what advantages it might have. For instance, all those lookalike towers, that's a lot of housing. And there's a reason why there's not so many homeless people in Seoul as there are in Los Angeles. The quantity of housing is huge. When I was going into Los Angeles this last trip, going into downtown, I saw the Wilshire Grand Center, but I also saw tent villages, just encampments of homeless people. And everybody I talked to said the homeless problem has gotten so much worse in the past couple of years. So there is an advantage if you're sort of putting out cookie cutter towers. There's a reason to do that.
Yeah. Well, I think everybody will agree that Seoul is probably the more practically minded of the two cities, perhaps. Yes. I guess the question is, if we're going to import lessons from Los Angeles and say, what can we say benchmark about Los Angeles and import to Seoul? Maybe inject Seoul with some of the passion that Banham describes. What would those strands be of Los Angeles's civic DNA?
People often describe Los Angeles as a city of neighborhoods, meaning the neighborhoods themselves are very distinct from one another. And almost because of the difficulty of accessing one from another historically. But as a result, they've all developed different identities. And oftentimes you talk to a foreigner who comes here, they say, I don't like how in Seoul you get on the train, you ride an hour and you get out the station in a neighborhood that looks exactly the same as the one you got in.
That is so true.
So neighborhood identity could be strengthened even more here, for example. And Los Angeles in a way. So Seoul could learn from Los Angeles, but Los Angeles could also learn from Los Angeles. As I say, Los Angeles should recover its sense of being a place that is architecturally experimental, that's finding its own style, that can have its own style. There could be a Seoul style of architecture that is undiscovered as yet. It could involve looking back to a previous iteration of Seoul, to the past. I mean, this is something that I complain about often, but the big projects in Seoul, the high-profile public spaces or buildings, often they're built by or designed by non-Korean architects or architects trained abroad. You don't see this in certain other countries, but the sense of a homegrown architecture is not strong here in a way that it once was in Los Angeles. Seoul could develop that. Los Angeles could rediscover it as well.
One of the luxuries that Los Angeles has is that the United States is a gigantic country and many different cities fulfill different functions. LA stereotypically is Hollywood, New York is finance, Washington is politics, and so forth. Seoul is everything here. It's everything rolled up in a gigantic ball.
Half the population lives in this area.
Yeah. I wonder if if that's an answer, regionalism in Seoul. Might we sort of spin off some of the functions of Seoul into other cities? Busan becomes this, and Gwangju becomes that, and so on and so forth. Gangneung becomes the city of some other thing. And maybe there's less weight on Seoul's shoulders to be everything.
You hear this example brought up especially, and this is extreme, but Daum moving to Jeju Island.
Okay.
And they're not the only company, but this sense of de-Seoulization has been preceded by that kind of extreme move where it's like, well, our employees, maybe they don't like the commuting lifestyle, maybe they want to live on an island. So that's maybe taking it a little far. But the regionalism, it could have an advantage, but everything is a double-edged sword. In America, maybe there's too much regionalism. I'm not sure where the balance is.
Yeah.
But with Seoul does have to shoulder almost every burden in this country. And it is in a way, the stand-in for Korea itself. When people talk about South Korea, they're most often talking about Seoul.
Surely.
When you talk about America, you're not talking about Los Angeles. Los Angeles is an exception, whereas Seoul is Korea in many ways.
One thread of commonality I hear between Seoul and Los Angeles, especially in this talk of a third Los Angeles, is an evolution into a share economy.
Yes.
Housing becomes more accommodating of many families. Transportation becomes more accommodating to anybody who wants to take it, and it's not just a car-driven economy. I think, and of course, we haven't even touched upon AI and self-driving cars and all of this sort of, Toffler-esque third wave technology kind of stuff that's going to radically transform cities. If we think in a science fiction kind of trajectory about technology shaping how we share resources, I can almost see Seoul and Los Angeles on a similar kind of trajectory, for better or worse.
It's an interesting way of thinking about it. Myself, I want to maintain my ties to Los Angeles, maybe live there part-time going forward. Mm-hmm. So looking for ways that the two can connect, the two can learn from each other. I mean, Los Angeles is the city with the highest Korean population outside of Korea, as far as I understand. So there's a pre-made connection there. And I think if Los Angeles learned a bit about building, say, housing from Seoul, and Seoul learned a bit about building an identity from Los Angeles, the two cities could attain a form that better suits their status, because these already are extremely high status cities of the 21st century. They need to have a physical form that better shows that off, that better suits that better tells the world sort of where they are.
I mean, there's such an intimate connection between Los Angeles and Seoul culturally. I think half of K-pop gets produced over in Los Angeles.
And so many videos, K-pop videos. You see Los Angeles in the background.
Yeah, I've seen more impressive Korean grocery stores in Los Angeles than I have in my neighborhood. So.
I lived by a few of those myself when I was there.
So there is a connection, and it'll be interesting to see the trajectory of development, urbanism-wise and otherwise. Never disappointing to talk to you, Colin. Thank you once again for coming in.
Thank you.